I'll never forget the night my name was erased in front of an entire room. My dish, hours of work, my heart poured into every cut and stir, was announced as hers. My mother-in-law's, the applause, the smiles, all of it washed over me like I didn't exist. And my husband? He just sat there, silent. That silence cut deeper than any insult. My name is Mara Rossi, and this is the story of how I learned that sometimes the people closest to you can steal more than your credit. They can steal your very place at the table. I thought marriage would mean finally belonging somewhere, but the first time I joined my husband Evan's family, at their big summer block party in Northie Shore, Massachusetts, I realized how wrong I was. That morning, I worked for hours in my tiny kitchen, roasting fennel and folding it into golden cornbread stuffing. It was the kind of dish that carried my pride. Simple, nourishing, made with care. Carrying the warm pan to the long table draped in red and white checks, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this would be the moment they saw me, not just as Evan's new wife, but as myself. When I returned to check on it, my chest went hollow. My dish had been pushed to the far side table, a green marker label stuck to the foil pan. Store-bought. Right in the center of the main table sat a bubbling lasagna with a crisped top, labeled in neat handwriting, homemade by Elaine. My mother-in-law stood tall, smiling broadly as neighbors passed by, praising her hard work. Then came Jenna, Evan's cousin, walking around with her phone, live streaming to the whole neighborhood. Her camera lingered on the lasagna, her voice gushing. "Look at Aunt Elaine's amazing homemade dish!" My breath caught when the lens dipped close. I recognized the parsley sprinkled across the top, scattered in my exact style, and the sharp, diagonal cuts of the knife, my knife. No one else noticed. No one else cared. I stood there frozen, holding a paper plate, heat rising in my face while the world clapped for her. Evan glanced at me, gave a weak half-smile, then looked away. He said nothing. That silence was the first crack. And I knew, deep down, it wouldn't be the last. Sunday dinners at Aunt Lucia's house were supposed to be warm, noisy gatherings, thick with the smell of simmering tomato sauce and garlic bread fresh from the oven. That night, I tried to blend in, to carry my weight quietly. When I reached for the parmesan, intending to grate a dusting over the steaming pasta, Elaine appeared behind me. She set her hand firmly over mine, correcting my motion as if I were a child. "Not like that," she said with a patronizing smile. "Let someone with experience do it." The table chuckled politely, as though her jab were harmless fun. Evan, sitting beside me, quickly filled everyone's wine glasses, hoping the moment would slip away unnoticed. But I felt my cheeks burn. I wasn't a guest anymore, I was family. Yet somehow, I was always being shown my place. Later, while helping Elaine carry dishes into the kitchen, I noticed a worn photocopy of the family recipe book poking out of her tote. My heart sank when I spotted a familiar scrawl penciled in the margins. "Reduce salt, add thyme," my handwriting. A note I had once jotted down for Evan when he'd asked for my version of a sauce. It wasn't just my food anymore. She had my words, my adjustments, my mind, folded neatly into her collection as if they'd always been hers. The following weekend, the parish hall smelled of chowder, fried dough, and sugar-dusted cannoli. I had spent hours crafting a lighter New England chowder, still rich with clams and potatoes, but balanced with celery and herbs, mindful of the older parishioners watching their diets. I carried it proudly to the buffet table, lifted the lid, and felt a quiet thrill at the steam rising. But just as I turned to greet a neighbor, Elaine appeared at my side. She dipped in a spoonful of cornstarch slurry and stirred it into the pot before I could stop her. "There!" she announced loudly, as eyes turned our way. "Now it's real chowder!" Laughter rippled awkwardly across the table. Someone said, "Looks thick enough now," and nodded approvingly. I gripped the ladle so hard my knuckles whitened, forcing a smile, swallowing the anger that pressed hot against my throat. But the damage was done. In one small gesture, Elaine had recast me as the outsider who didn't know tradition, while she stood as the guardian of authentic flavor. I understood then. This wasn't about food. It was about territory. The kitchen wasn't neutral ground. It was a battlefield. And Elaine was making sure everyone saw who held the power. The family gathered on the rocky shore of Cape Ann, sea breeze whipping through the tents, the smoke from open fires drifting into the salt air. Laughter carried across the sand as trays of clams, corn, and potatoes were pulled steaming from the pit. I had brought something different, a tray of eggplant caponata, rich with olive oil, capers, and sweet tomatoes. It wasn't traditional, but it was thoughtful, a dish for the cousins watching their cholesterol, for the aunt who couldn't stomach shellfish. I placed it carefully beside the trays of clams, hoping it would at least be noticed. Elaine's voice cut through the chatter, sharp and dismissive. "Who brought the food court special?" She smirked, then tapped the tray of clams. This is real food!" A burst of laughter rippled across the group, not just a chuckle, full, hearty laughter. For the first time, they weren't just politely indulging her jabs. They joined in. I stood there, the waves crashing behind me, the smoke from the fire stinging my eyes. Heat burned in my face, but I forced my jaw still. My caponata sat untouched, and I, though married into this family, had never felt more like an outsider. Only Uncle Mike didn't laugh. He drummed his fingers softly on the wooden table, his eyes meeting mine for a brief second. It was quiet, subtle, but it was enough to tell me I wasn't completely invisible. A week later, the banquet hall in Salem glittered with chandeliers. It was the department's biggest fundraiser of the year. Elaine, in a tailored dress, glided from guest to guest with practiced charm. She was co-chair of the evening, every spotlight tilting her way. Harbor and Hearth had been hired to cater, a name that carried weight. In the bustle of the kitchen, Chef Leo spotted me. He had once been my student at the community kitchen. His face was drawn with panic. "Mara, I need you. One of my guys is sick. We can't plate the short ribs fast enough." I hesitated, then slipped on a plain white apron. No introductions, no announcements, just work. I tasted the sauce, added a splash of red wine, salt, and let it bloom. The ribs softened, the aroma swelling rich and deep. From the dining room came clinking glasses, jazz drifting through the doors, and then the sound of applause. "Best meal we've had at a gala," someone said, the praise carrying all the way into the kitchen. My chest ached with both pride and bitterness. Then Elaine's voice boomed over the microphone. "Tonight's success is thanks to tradition. The women in this family have always inspired me." The audience erupted in applause, clapping for her supposed influence. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen, the scent of short ribs still clinging to my hands, the sound of applause swelling for someone else's name. My work had filled their plates, but my name remained locked behind a swinging door. The morning after the gala, I sat staring out at the harbor when my phone buzzed with an unexpected call. It was Frank, my father-in-law. His voice was steady, deliberate. "Meet me at the diner by the pier." The place was nearly empty when I arrived. The neon sign above the door flickered, half lit, humming faintly. Frank sat in a corner booth, shoulders slouched, a steaming mug of black coffee before him. He tore off a piece of white bread, dipped it into the coffee, and chewed slowly. It was a strange habit, one that seemed almost childlike, yet grounding. When I slid into the booth across from him, he reached into his coat and pulled out a plain envelope. He pushed it toward me with a firm hand. "Read it," he said. The paper trembled slightly as I unfolded it. His handwriting, though shaky, was clear. "You are the one who has kept this family eating together. From the block party to the potluck to the gala. Your work has carried us. Though no one called your name, it's time the truth was spoken." Frank leaned back, his gaze unwavering. "This Sunday, I'm going to read that letter. Everyone needs to hear it. You can't keep being erased." My throat tightened. Part of me felt seen. Finally, someone acknowledged the truth. But fear rose just as quickly. "If you read this, it'll tear everything open," I whispered. "Sometimes that's the only way to heal," he replied, dipping another piece of bread into his coffee. I stared at the letter, the words heavy as stone. Do I really want the battlefield brought to the dinner table? Sunday came, and with it, the weight of inevitability. The dining room at Aunt Lucia's was bright, the long table set with pasta and red wine, candles flickering. Elaine glowed at the head of the table, recounting the gala as though she alone had carried it. Laughter and nods of approval circled back to her like a crown she wore effortlessly. I barely touched my plate, waiting for Frank. His hands shook slightly as he set down his fork. He pulled the letter from his pocket, unfolded it with care, and began to read. The room stilled. Even the clinking of cutlery stopped. His voice, though wavering, cut through the air. The meals that held this family together weren't mine, weren't Elaine's. They were Mara's. She was the one in the kitchen at the gala. She has been the one all along, gasps. Silence. Then Jenna raised her phone higher, live streaming to her followers with the caption, "Family Truth Time," as if on cue. A message buzzed on her screen. She turned it toward the table. A photo from Chef Leo, snapped in the gala kitchen. There I was, apron tied tight, spoon in hand, tasting the short ribs, proof undeniable. Elaine's hand jerked. The wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the table. Red wine bled across the white cloth like an open wound. Her face twisted, her voice rising shrill. "I only did this for the family's honor." But her outburst betrayed more than she intended. It wasn't about honor. It was about power, about control, about the son she feared losing. I sat frozen, my heart pounding. The truth was finally on the table, but it had cost us all our silence. The dining room still reeked of spilled wine. The red stain on the white tablecloth spread like a wound no one dared to touch. Plates of pasta sat untouched, steam curling upward and vanishing into silence. No one spoke. The truth had been laid bare by Frank's letter, but it hung in the room like smoke after a fire, heavy and choking. I pushed my chair back and stood. The legs scraped hard against the wood floor, a sound that made every head turn. My hands trembled, but my voice came out steady. "From this day on, I will not cook for anyone who treats me like a ghost." Elaine's eyes widened, her mouth opening, but I didn't let her speak. I continued, each word deliberate. "There are 3 conditions. First, you apologize, publicly, not behind closed doors. Second, you return the recipes that are mine. And third," I turned to Evan, my throat tight, "you choose. No more hiding behind silence. No more pretending neutrality is protection." Evan stared down at the table, his knuckles white around his fork. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking clock on the wall, each second hammering louder and louder in my chest. I feared he would stay quiet again, that his silence would finish what Elaine had started. Then he moved, slowly. He lifted his hand and set it firmly on my shoulder. His voice cracked, but the words were clear. "If you don't apologize, Mom, we won't be coming back to this table again." Gasps rippled around the room. Elaine's face crumpled, tears spilling as she fumbled for the family recipe book. She flipped through until she reached a page marked with my handwriting. With shaking fingers, she slipped the sheet into a plastic cover, sealing it as though it were something fragile at last recognized for its worth. She pushed it across the table toward me, her voice breaking. I should have done this long ago." The page slid toward me, glossy under the light, my words preserved at last. In that moment, I felt the line drawn, the boundary that had been missing all along. The first sign that something had shifted came quietly. On a Thursday morning, I opened the parish Facebook group, and there it was. A post from Elaine. Just one sentence, written in her careful script. The meal at the gala was not mine. It was Mara's. She deserves the credit. For a long moment, I simply stared at the screen. Those words, so small, so plain, felt heavier than anything she had ever thrown at me. Not because they erased the hurt, but because, for once, she admitted the truth out loud. And this time, the whole community could see it. That Sunday, I tied my apron in the soup kitchen's modest back room. The clatter of metal trays and the low hum of volunteers filled the air. Steam from the chicken soup I had simmered all morning rose in fragrant clouds, fogging the glass panels of the swinging doors. Elaine walked in behind me, dressed in a borrowed apron, her hands twisting the ties nervously. She looked smaller somehow, stripped of the authority she carried at every family table. Without a word, she took her place beside the bread station, slicing baguettes and stacking them neatly. When the doors opened and the line of guests filed in, I ladled soup into paper bowls. Elaine handed each guest a piece of bread. For the first time, she didn't compete, didn't direct, she simply served. Then, when the parish volunteers gathered around to help distribute the food, Elaine cleared her throat. Her voice wavered, but she spoke loudly enough for the room to hear. "This is Mara's chicken noodle soup. She made it. I'm just here to help." The words landed like a stone in still water, rippling through every person in that kitchen. My chest tightened, my hands gripping the ladle. It was the first time she had introduced me properly, the first time my work had been given its rightful name. Later, when the last bowls had been served and the kitchen quieted, Elaine approached me with the family recipe book clutched in her arms. She pressed it into my hands. "It belongs to you as much as to anyone," she said softly. I flipped through and saw my penciled notes preserved in the plastic sleeve she'd added. My name wasn't just recognized now, it was protected. Then came the final turn. Elaine looked at me, almost shyly. "We should do something with this. Write a family cookbook together. Leave a legacy." I held her gaze, steady and unflinching. "Only if every recipe is credited to the right person. Every single one. If not, there will be no book, for once." Elaine didn't argue. She simply nodded, her eyes damp, as if she finally understood. The soup pot still steamed behind me, the scent of thyme and chicken filling the air. For the first time, my name floated above it, intact, and I realized that apologies aren't words at all. They're verbs, measured in actions, carried out in front of others, where the truth can't be erased. The soup kitchen was nothing fancy, just stainless steel counters, folding chairs, and the steady shuffle of people in need. Yet that Sunday, as sunlight streamed through the high windows, the air carried a different weight, quiet, purposeful, almost reverent. I stood behind a pot so large it could have fed a battalion, ladling out chicken noodle soup into paper bowls. The steam rose in clouds, carrying with it the scent of thyme, carrots, and broth that had simmered since dawn. My hands moved steadily, almost ritualistic. Pour, hand over, smile, repeat. Beside me, Elaine worked silently, slicing loaves of bread and passing each piece to the guests with a nod. The sharp edge of her superiority had dulled. She no longer hovered or directed, no longer claimed space that wasn't hers. She was just another pair of hands, working, serving, giving. Across the room, Evan moved between tables, wiping spills, pulling out chairs, leaning down to speak gently with an older man in a worn coat. For once, his silence wasn't absence, it was action, presence in its simplest form. Jenna stood near the door with her phone raised, filming the steady rhythm of service. Later, I caught a glimpse of her caption. "Credit matters." 2 small words, but they struck like a gavel. What had been denied to me for so long was now written plainly, seen by everyone. At the sink, Uncle Mike scrubbed a heavy stock pot, his sleeves rolled up. When our eyes met, he gave me a small nod. No speech, no grand gesture, just quiet recognition, which in its own way meant more than applause. No one laughed at me. No one whispered comparisons. The room hummed with the simple dignity of work done together. Honestly, with names attached to the right hands. I glanced up at the wooden plaque nailed above the door. The words carved deep into its surface seemed to glow in the afternoon light. Community is a verb. The truth of it washed over me. Community wasn't about who got the credit or who held the recipe book. It wasn't about clinging to tradition as a weapon. It was about showing up, doing the work, and giving people their rightful place at the table. Just as apology wasn't a word but an act, community wasn't an idea but a practice. For the first time in years, I smiled without hesitation. The boundaries I had fought for were now clear, drawn not with anger, but with truth. And with those boundaries came respect, the kind that couldn't be stolen, mislabeled, or passed off as someone else's. I looked back at the soup simmering gently in the pot. This time, it carried not just nourishment, but my name, spoken aloud, acknowledged, unchallenged. The meal had a name, and so did I.